Well, hello there, and welcome to yet another fascinating session on leading organizational change. In this particular session, we're going to be talking about whole organization interventions. This will be probably one of the larger lectures, only because there's actually a whole lot that organizational development technicians and theorists have had to say about this particular area. But much of what I'll be covering is actually found in your book, so should you decide to duck out before we get to the end, I don't think you'll miss much other than perhaps some analogies, examples that I might be giving along the way. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Thought I would spend some time first maybe talking about, some keys to success for whole organization interventions. There are a number of things that we have learned oftentimes through trial and failure that you really have to keep in mind anytime you're attempting to do anything with the whole organization. First one has to do with having structure. We have to first of all make sure that we have the right participants, have to make sure that all of the necessary skills, knowledge, and abilities are there. We also have to make sure that we take time to ensure that the agenda has been communicated to all of the participants ahead of time. Another thing that we have to do is we have to make sure that the objectives are clear, realistic, and that they've actually been widely shared and comprehensive across the whole organization. And probably just as important is that we don't want a very rigid structure. We have to oftentimes be able to adapt that structure along the way. Another thing, and perhaps one of the most important things, is that there has to be an appropriate climate in terms of the sentiment and emotions and mood among the people. It's important that climate be non-defensive, and that there would be some professional facilitation techniques. Oftentimes, these kind of interventions fail because there isn't a necessary level of trust and respect pre-existing among team members or individual members of an organization. So generally, much of this work probably needs to be preceded by some team building exercises before you can actually get to a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about. And then finally, as with the whole notion of organizational development, it has to be member-oriented. Remember that one of the key goals of OD is that there would be capacity building. In other words, we need to transfer knowledge to the organization. Well, we have to transfer the change process to members. The members of the organization, they have to own much of what we're talking about. And of course, when we do that, this will build internal commitment for change as opposed to external pressure or any of those kind of things that really are more external forms of motivation. So let's just kind of briefly outline some of the interventions that we're going to be talking about. So we think of these as some of the more common whole organization interventions. First one is the notion of organizational culture change, organization design, directional interventions, which typically includes things like strategic planning, future search conferences, quality and product interventions, things such as Six Sigma, total quality management, re-engineering, mergers and acquisitions, and then finally we'll talk a little bit about trans-organizational developments. So let's move right into talking about organizational culture. I have mentioned in previous lectures a little bit about organizational culture, but we get to kind of drill down a little bit. Culture is one of those things that in many sense we sort of see it all around us, and yet what we're actually only seeing is the tip of the iceberg. Depending upon the theorists, culture might include the things that you see, such as styles of dress or the architecture or office layout, the jargon and language that people use around the organization, all the way down to those things that you can't see, such as the underlying philosophies or preferences or values or even the assumptions or mental models that people hold in the organization. Where different theorists part ways is whether or not all of these things are a part of culture Or in fact, is culture really only the thing that we see at the bottom, those hidden assumptions and values, with the other things just simply being outgrowth of them? I think either way, if you're going to be doing some kind of cultural assessment, you're going to be looking for and attempting to assess all of these things. So I think in terms of a cultural assessment, it probably doesn't matter whether you consider all of these things to be, in fact, components of culture itself, or whether or not you think they're just simply indicators of a much more latent, invisible notion of culture. Oftentimes, when we have done culture assessments, there's generally an attempt to sort of segment, if you will, organizations into various types of cultures. And so there's something called the clan culture, in which people tend to strongly identify with groups, as in sort of a family. There's a lot of emphasis on teamwork, and what you see among individuals is that there's a tremendous amount of loyalty and friendliness occurring in those cases. In an adhocracy type of culture, they're characterized by high innovation. So these might be the kind of cultures that you might see existing within, say, research and development kinds of organizations. There's a lot of emphasis on cutting-edge products and services and leading the market. So if you think about, say, electronics companies like Apple, for example, you might think of this type of culture. And then there are your relatively more hierarchical types of culture, where tradition and formality tend to be the more dominant values. There's a greater emphasis on stability, rules, efficient processes. Typically, these are your organizations that exist within environments that are relatively stable. So if you think about beer companies, for example, we don't generally like our beer to be different from one time to another. And so in those cases, the beer companies aren't really actively searching for new ways to rebrew their beer. In fact, there's an emphasis on ensuring that your beer is fairly consistent tasting, in that case there. And so you might find those organizations being more hierarchical. And then finally, there is the market type of culture. In this kind of culture, you might expect a higher value on competitiveness. You might expect these to be a lot more demanding in that sense there. And so, for example, these might not be innovation cultures in that sense, but they're definitely going to be cultures in which there's heavy emphasis on competition. And so these tend to be segments. I would say that the thing that you want to be careful about, and that is really thinking of culture in types. For example, it's more than likely that all organizations might have a little bit of all of these. And so rather than thinking about placing your organization within, say, one of these types as opposed to the other, it might be better to think of these as dimensions, along which any one organization might vary. So there may be somewhat moderate with respect to clan and adhocracy, but they may be relatively high or low on the remaining types in that case. So once again, I would suggest that you think about these as dimensions rather than as types when thinking about how one might do an organizational assessment. Okay, so let's move on. And let's talk a little bit about organization design. One of the distinctions that your book makes that you ought to definitely heed is the distinction between the word design and structure. Oftentimes people take these terms to be synonymous, and they really are not. When we're talking about design, we're really talking about much more than just structure. So in your book, this idea of the STAR model of organizational design is introduced. And you'll notice at the top of this model is the notion of strategy, for which structure, processes, rewards, and people are sort of intimately connected to the idea of strategy. So if we then move and talk a little bit about the idea of structure, there are various dimensions of structure. For example, the specialization of tasks becomes important. The shape and span of control, right? What we mean is simply decision-making power. Distribution of power, whether or not power tends to be more centralized among, say, an upper few or whether or not power is decentralized, whether or not it's spread out at the lower levels. And then the degree of departmentalization, how many organizational groupings there are. Then these various dimensions of structure then produces various types of structure. Things such as functional, and the word divisional isn't on there, but it's definitely a type of structure that's talked about in your book. Matrix structures, geographic structures, process structures. Okay? And so each of these constitutes different ways in which organizations may, in fact, arrange their workflows. There are a variety of different organizational structures that are discussed in your book. I think most of you are already well familiar with the idea of the functional structure and the unit structure, where you either kind of organize around functional departments or you're organized around more products. Some of the more innovative structures that have come out only in recent years have been things like the matrix organization, which sort of represents to some degree a hybrid between the functional and unit structure. Be interested to know how many of you have actually had an experience working within a matrix organization. But for example, if you've worked in a hospital, you've probably worked within a matrix organization. Many nurses, for example, are in matrix organizations in the sense that they're reporting usually to a head nurse and or some doctor that's on call. Legal secretaries. So if you've worked in a law firm, you might have worked within a matrix structure. Many legal secretaries have, once again, a head secretary to which they're accountable, as well as some lead attorney in that case there. But there are definitely other types of organizations in which you might see matrix designs as well. Then there's sort of the idea of the network organization. These are generally relatively small organizations who then outsource a number of the other kind of functions that exist there. And then probably a little bit more recently has been the idea of the boundary-less or process kind of structure, in which organizations are really designed around the way that things might flow. So you might have a product design unit, if you will, and then processing customer orders, manufacturing shipping orders, and billing collection. And these are somewhat arranged in the nature in which work might flow, which is definitely different from the other models that we've seen. So moving right along, let's talk a little bit about some of the strategic planning kinds of initiatives. Generally, when we think about strategies, there are a variety of strategies, typically three. One strategy that your organization might choose to have is the strategy of uniqueness, in the sense that the organization might see itself as really offering something to the market that is different from what is already existing there, or what other people might be offering to that market. On the other hand, what you might do is sort of take more of a value type of competitive strategy, in the sense that you might be attempting to deliver products and services that seem to have, the uniqueness of having low cost. If you think about something like a Walmart, for example, the idea to be able to offer name brand products at the lowest cost might be that, or it may be that you have some relatively desirable features that are important there as well. Another strategy might be to have something that's sort of quite difficult to imitate. And so you may actually be able to produce something in a way that nobody else can produce it, or deliver it in a way that no one else can deliver it. And so in that sense, you might have somewhat of a monopoly with respect to the market that you're in. All right, so once again, so these are three particular strategies that people might choose to have. But then let's talk about how is it that an organization might orient themselves towards something like this. The idea of strategic planning is definitely not an invention of OD, but it's definitely been an area in which org development consultants have gotten into. And so as a result, have really attempted to kind of illustrate the importance of taking an OD approach to strategic planning. One particular model that tends to demonstrate that is what's discussed in your book around this idea of integrated strategic change. So I want to kind of talk with you about that. This sort of walks through a number of processes, and once again, each of these are discussed in your book, and so this information is not unique. But when doing integrated strategic change, the first step is something called a strategic analysis. And in this analysis, you're really assessing the readiness for change, right? So issues around being resistant to change, you're really attempting to uncover if those things are there, as well as the competency of top management to be able to carry out this particular change. Also, you want to diagnose the current strategic orientation. Right? How well that strategic orientation is doing. Those of you familiar with the concept of a SWOT analysis, in which you'd be looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Right? This is generally when something like that might be carried out. The next step is the process of actually engaging in the strategy making. And it's important here that you make some decisions about the type and degree of strategic change that you're going to engage in. Next is the idea of then designing the strategic change plan. And much of this is really just simply coming up with an agenda that maps out the steps and perhaps timelines by which you're going to engage in this plan. And then finally, are the steps of actually engaging in the steps in implementing the strategic plan. One of the key roles here is the role of leadership in being able to craft vision and then provide motivation for people to kind of want to get in step with that. Throughout all these steps, what's very important that's oftentimes neglected within just more generic strategic planning is the role of people, and take consideration the mentality and the perceptions that people are having about the change or the potential change, and what the consequences of that change might be for themselves. And so in that sense, the OD consultant should be very in tune and with the human element here. Another particular method, along with strategic planning, that is typically referred to as sort of the directional interventions in your book, is this idea of a future search conference. And this would be one in which definitely I would love to hear if any of you had an opportunity to participate in something like this, because generally you don't see this as often. But future search conferences are typically billed as sort of a 3-day conference of approximately 60 participants who are chosen from a wide variety of stakeholder groups. Typically the theme of this type of conference is to get the whole system in the room all at the same time. Of course, with only 60 participants, we're not really talking about literally having the entire organization, but I think it's the idea that you truly have representatives from every element in your organization. And what you're going to be doing during this 3-day conference is that you're going to be exploring the past, present, and the future of the organization through a relatively structured format. So just to kind of map out what this might look like, say on day 1, this is generally the day in which you're going to focus on the past, but you're also going to provide time for people to focus not just on the organization's past, but also on their own personal past, as well as the past of just what's happened in the environment generally, as well as beginning to focus on the current trends that they believe is impacting the organization. Day 2, this becomes an opportunity in which you would then put everyone within their stakeholder group, so in other words, people with like jobs together, and those people have the opportunity to kind of reflect on things that they, as a stakeholder group, are both proud of, and perhaps some things that they're not too proud of, some things that they're sort of sorry for, their mistakes, if you will. And then from that, begin to kind of imagine a future, and then provide even some presentations in which they might act out that future. this tends to be the more entertaining part of the activity, and for many people, the most meaningful. On day 3, that's when we're able to then begin to fold this into some agreements about what the future might look like, and then begin to do some action planning about how we might go forth and make that future reality. Okay, so let's now change and talk a little bit about some of the quality and productivity interventions. And these tend to be those that are sort of most popular, so I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on them. Beginning with total quality management, this is something that perhaps most of you are already familiar with. Total quality management was actually developed by Edward Deming, whose ideas were actually first attempted in the United States, but we essentially ignored the poor guy. So he said, forget about this, and he went overseas to Japan after World War II and actually found a more receptive audience. In many ways, I think it really worked there because their culture, being much more focused around the collective, immediately recognized one of the essential qualities of total quality management. That is the idea of getting people involved through the usage of groups. But of course, the focus here is much more on quality and minimizing the notion of errors. And so through a variety of statistical controls, the focus is on minimizing the amount of deviation that in the quality of products or services, if you will. Closely related to total quality management is the idea of Six Sigma. In some ways, Six Sigma is an attempt to improve upon total quality management. It didn't take this country very long to realize that we probably could not stick to all of the principles that Deming preached, mainly because we're a fairly individualistic culture. And some of the total quality management principles actually advocated abandoning that. So, for example, Edward Deming believed that performance appraisals were a cancer to most organizations. Can you imagine what it would be like if we didn't base people's pay in this country upon individual merit? Right? That just simply flies in the face of our rugged individualism in this case there, and yet that's essentially what he advocated, getting rid of the idea of recognizing either for the purpose of reward or punishment, individual performance in that case. We simply couldn't tolerate that. And so oftentimes, when you try to borrow principles and you don't borrow the whole package, it doesn't work all that well. So total quality management didn't seem to work all that well for a lot of our organizations here. So Six Sigma really is an attempt to kind of improve upon that by not so much focusing just on the idea of quality, but more importantly, focusing on the process that occurs. And then finally, the idea of re-engineering, which has unfortunately become in many organizations a cuss word or slang for downsizing, because unfortunately that's what it sort of got associated with. But it doesn't necessarily have to include downsizing. It really refers to just sort of a reorganizing, if you will, of the organization, but for the purpose of improving quality and productivity in that case. So in some ways, of all the things that I'm talking about in this session, these 3 are the most popular and considered the most faddish, if you will. Let's talk a little bit about merger and acquisitions. Which have become extremely popular within the past 2 or 3 decades, and which is quite curious given the fact that many statistics suggest that somewhere between 50 to 75% of mergers and acquisitions fail in terms of their objectives and goals to achieve greater productivity. But yet they continue to go on with even bigger mergers and even bigger acquisitions. So let's talk a little about the rationale for why one might actually want to do this. One has to do with diversification. An organization that views itself as being too narrow in terms of what it's focusing on, and therefore too vulnerable to any one market, might attempt to expand itself so that it doesn't have all its eggs in one basket, so to speak. So diversification might be rationale for doing that. Vertical integration. An organization might really kind of see the necessity to bring in those organizations on which it actually depended upon to somehow be able to deal with usually sort of market fluctuations. If you feel like, the prices of, some of your supplies keep fluctuating too much, then you might just simply acquire your former supplier, if you will. And that way you can regulate, if you will, that price fluctuation. Gaining access to global markets, technology, or other resources. The idea of global markets, I think, goes along somewhat with the idea of diversification, but in this case we're really talking about more than just product expansion. We're talking about really geographical expansion. Technology is a good one, right? Sometimes organizations might admire software or other forms of technology of other organizations, and therefore want to acquire those organizations mainly to kind of utilize that technology. In that case there. Good. And then finally, achieving operational efficiencies, improved innovation, or resource sharing. Much like the rationale of gaining additional technologies, organizations may merge or acquire other organizations really for the purpose of being able to utilize resources that are existing in other organizations. So much of this information is what's discussed in your book, and that is the fact that there's a huge failure rate among mergers and acquisitions, once again, both financially and personally, with the idea that a tremendous number of senior leaders actually tend to leave the organization following that. But there is a notion that the success rate can be improved within each stage of the merger. So if you think about the pre-contract stage that's discussed in your book, the importance of human due diligence, making sure that you take some time to ascertain some of the cultural challenges, the ways in which there might be gaps between the two cultures of the different organizations. And so therefore having a integration team who's going to purposely be paying attention to that would be an important thing in this pre-contract stage. At the combination stage, take some time to determine the type of acculturation that's going to take place. Acculturation generally refers to the process by which one organization is brought into the culture of another organization. And so there are a variety of different ways in which that might happen. Assimilation generally is where let's say the acquired organization essentially loses, if you will, its culture and assumes the culture of the parent organization. In terms of integration, right, that's much more of a 50-50 split, if you will, in terms of the two cultures sort of coming together. In some cases, both of the previous organizations are probably going to have to lose aspects of their former cultures in as much as those are not compatible with the new culture. Separation might be something whereby the acquisition may be really in name only, and they may actually allow that organization to continue to function as they are. So, for example, if you think about the idea of Nestle Purina, Nestle is actually a Swiss company located all the way over in Switzerland, and Purina being here in St. Louis, essentially Purina pretty much operates the way that it did before, with the exception of the name Nestle sitting on top of it. There really hasn't been much of a change to the way that they operate, or the personnel, or even the geographical, physical space in which they do things, right? So it's probably much more of a separation type of culture. And then there can be sort of a deculturation. This is generally where the newly acquired organization loses its old culture, but does not assume the culture of the new company. This tends to be the death, if you will, of that organization, because it would have no sense of itself, it would have no sense of direction in that case there, and so this is generally the spelling of the end, if you will. And then finally, there is the post-combination stage. And generally, at this point, you're continuing to do a little bit of evaluation to make sure that integration problems don't sort of keep cropping up. Okay, and so finally, there's then the transorganizational development. Your book sort of mentions that oftentimes these are called sort of meta-organizations, and that these are becoming quite pervasive. I think your book mentions that there's almost 200,000 of these in Europe alone. And so these sort of networks. There's actually a term for these in Japan, and I'm blanking on it at the moment, so sorry. But what you'll find is that just about every continent or every country probably has a different term for it. But once again, very popular, and it gets almost at sort of this idea of sort of this network type of structure. But in this case, these are really whole organizations who sort of come together for the purpose of generally sort of producing some product or some service. If you're going to have one of these, then there are essentially sort of three steps that you want to think through. The first one being the idea of identification. In other words, identifying who should belong to this type of system. So things that you want to think about are what are the relevant skills, knowledge, and resources, and or who are the key stakeholders for whatever issue that you're trying to deal with. The next step would then be convention. Should you create one of these, and so you have to really think about the cost and benefits. You also have to think about the various task perceptions. How do the different potential stakeholders see the task, and is there some synergy between that? Then there's the idea of organization. How to organize for the task performance. How is communication going to be dealt with? Who's going to lead this? And then what should be the policies and procedures for ensuring that there's a tight-knit form of organization occurring here. And then finally, there's the notion of evaluation. How is this combination, if you will, how is it performing? So you might want to look at things like performance outcomes. Are you reaching the goals that you set out to attempt to reach? What's the quality of interaction among the transorganizational members, if you will? And then to what degree is this satisfying for the various stakeholders who are participating in it? So, once again, these are 4 steps that you would have to consider as you might be working through or helping a transorganizational type of structure to function more effectively. Okay, so this slide ends our lecture on whole organization interventions. And so until next time, I'll talk to you later.